Welcome everybody to this special McCall New Book Seminar focused on two books about music by our colleagues. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which this university is situated, the Watamatical people of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the dream time. So it's my pleasure to hand over now to our colleague, Dr. Richard Savory, who's a Macquarie University Research Fellow, and he's going to talk to Dennis Crowdy about Dennis's very recent book, Code Musicology, From Hardwired to Software. So over to you, Richard. And just to let you know, there'll be about half an hour discussing this book, an opportunity for some questions, and then we will replicate the format with Adrian talking about his book to Ian Collinson. So over to you, Richard.
Thanks. Cool, it'll be really good to talk about the book. So my first question I want to find out is, what is Code Musicology?
Right. It's an attempt to connect software studies with popular music studies and ethnomusicology. But I guess, yeah, so that inevitably draws on popular music studies, ethnomusicology, media studies to some extent, and this kind of growing field of software studies.
Mm-hmm. So what is a code exactly?
So I was reasonably critical in the opening of the book about the way we use the word digital and digitalization and digitization as a kind of metonym for the broader concept. And I think to some extent I'm probably doing that here. So that code, on one level it's text, but really what I'm talking about is the agency of code. And I do this around kind of two main ideas. One is what I'm calling the life of code, which is its, I guess, sort of perceived agency once in operation, and also the life around code. So the idea that people write code, and that has a consequence for music, as more and more of the music that we engage with is mediated, although I'm using a word later in the book called modulated, by code.
Yeah, so I guess you see code as something that, for me there's all these different layers, of course. There's the code that someone writes to their computer, and then that actually gets compiled. So then it becomes a stage where people can't understand what the code is. Yeah. So if you're analysing this code, where are you looking? Are you trying to understand the output, the input, the code? At what level are you actually trying to study?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that software studies has been really clear about is talking about the life of code as a sort of concept, much broader. So not, diving into line-by-line code analysis, but talking about the influences of the largely male population in San Francisco that generates a lot of the code that we're talking about. And right down to that textual level though too, because I think there is a space for looking at, one of the things I look at in the book are comments in code. It's very interesting to go through open source code and find what programmers have written. Sometimes it's obscene, but sometimes it's really interesting things about, there's this crazy quirk in a DX7 that was never intended by the designers, but here we are emulating it. And I find that really interesting. And that's one of the things I talk about, how code kind of carries culture with it. So, and I guess that's one of the challenges of the book, is getting across this idea that code is not just the stuff that we write and compile, but there is this kind of, I guess, more metonymic use of the term.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's really challenging to me, is that there's no fixed code. Like, code never finishes. Whereas compared to musicology, you have a score. Like, there's a definitive final version, really. But that definitely doesn't exist for code. And so how does that translate to actually studying the code?
Well, one of the things that I talk about is how code music unfolds in time, clearly. And one of the things that happens when the kind of agency that code can have is applied to music is that the way that music unfolds in time, conceptually, becomes a much more fluid thing. So if we're thinking of a score, I perform the Prelude to Bach's Lute Suite badly, but from top to bottom, you can clearly hear what the music, what the wrong notes are, and it's the same, more or less, in a sort of allographic sense at least, all the time. And that's how we understand recorded music. It has a kind of a beginning and an end and a way through it. But there's no reason when code is creating music why that can't be much, much more fluid. And yeah, I think I've gone for slight.
Yeah, no. So when you say more fluid, I'm not actually exactly sure what you mean. So which part more?
Oh, well, I mean the idea that music doesn't have to be the same every time you hear it. I mean, if I'm used to the idea of listening to something on Apple Music or Spotify and hearing the same thing every time. If I pull up Taylor Swift's, whatever it is from that, You're on Your Own Kid or whatever it happens to be, I expect it to be the same each time.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no reason why that should be the case when the medium through which that music is being recreated so at its very core invites changes in the order. And so, I'm thinking here of algorithmic music. I can see Sarah here, thinking of Sarah's thesis, about how we understand music to unfold in time, in a sequence, but it hasn't always been like that, and it's not necessarily always going to be like that. And I think we're at a kind of really interesting point in history where we might be seeing a change there, because, largely, of the way code modulates that process.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think for me, the counter to that is the code has been what's pushed us to this position. Like if you think about audio workstations and these systems, that's what's made us become really quantized and really strapped to this time frame. So it seems like you're arguing that code can take us back away from what code kind of put us into.
Yeah, I mean, here I'm thinking in sort of more recent invocations of digital audio workstations like Ableton, where there's a lot of chants built in, where Max MSP, this kind of really flexible modular system, is built in to the digital audio workstation, and where people are encouraged to kind of modulate modulators in really complicated ways that mean that the music is not going to be the same. I've just created an electronic piece for students in Ableton, and I've got a kind of generative bit in the middle. And every time I record it, of course, that little break is different. Yeah. And that's interesting to me. And I think that's kind of what I'm speaking to about this idea of fluidity of structure in a time-based form like music.
So another thing you talk about in the book is the idea that code and the cultural heritage of code. I'm kind of curious who decides what code is important when you talk about this heritage. How are we going to make it not be the same as, I guess, traditional musicology really preferences like Western cultural trends? And can't we easily end up with the same thing where it is the San Francisco coders who are prioritizing? So how would you manage that sort of relationship with Code Musicology?
Yeah, I don't think I have an answer to that question. I think the book in many ways is a call to ethnomusicologists and popular music studies people, and to some extent people involved in music information retrieval, is to say, look, there is a really big world of music out there, but the 5,000 data points over which the latest artificial intelligence music LM engine was sort of built on originally, or that's advertised in the paper, is this kind of really, really tiny subset that came as a result of historical processes of universities and states putting things together. And it's a tiny kind of representation of the world's music. I typed into music LM is a really interesting, as you know, recently released artificial intelligence engine by Google. It's Google, isn't it?
Yeah, it's Google.
And it's text-based. You can type in something and it will create quite good audio of what it thinks, you know, funky bass line, 80s style. You can't say Kylie because no names, or you can't even say Mozart. People think about it, but you can sort of say in the style of, you know, 80s pop, or whatever it happens to be, and it churns something out. And I searched for music of Papua New Guinea because I'm an ethnomusicologist and quite familiar with that. That's my main area of research, or has been. And I heard something, and it was kind of familiar, but it was popular music. It was a kind of late 90s, early 2000s. It was a very clear corpus over which Papua New Guinean music was being represented in this particular engine. No doubt that's going to change radically, but I think it's really important that we're aware of that. And I guess ethnomusicologists and popular music studies people are scared of technology. And maybe scared is too strong, but reticent to engage with some of the kind of technical areas involved in talking about it. And I guess I want to kind of try and start to break that down and talk to people and say, hey, we need to talk about this at whatever level we're able to.
Yeah, I think so. You talked a bit about music information retrieval, MIR. And so I think some of the questions are coming up on the other side. Like I know some people at Spotify who work in the area, and so it's not that easy to decide what to recommend to people. Because do you want to push them down the same line? Do you want to make them repeat what they're doing? You can really easily promote record label interests. And in fact, that's basically what they do because they're partly owned by record labels. And so I don't know, how do you think that balances in? How can you try and, I guess, because to me, there's a bit you talk about having a call to people who are developing these technologies and pushing ideas. So how would you encourage that in this scope?
I remember talking to someone from a company that does mastering of tracks through artificial intelligence. A large startup whose offices, or at least his office, wasn't that far away from some of the offices of Spotify, I believe, in New York, where some of this was going on. And one of the reasons that I think it's important to talk to some of the people that are actually engaging in this, because this person sort of said to me, oh yeah, we're sharing databases all the time. Yeah. And it was this sense that the people developing don't really know.
Yeah.
Because they've only got limited access to things, or the database that they're building up from, you know, what users are kind of providing. But when I look, say, at music information retrieval, I look at the abstracts of papers and the titles of papers. Every now and again, something will pop up, the ethics of using, you know, vocal training or whatever it happens to be on these models. But I don't see the people from the professional associations that I'm associated with, you know, ICTM, Society for Ethnomusicology, IASPM. They're not there. We're not there. We need to be.
Yeah.
I think we've got insights that are valuable. And asking those questions that you just asked, well, you know, hang on a second. Shouldn't we be looking at the huge database that's being generated by streaming service X in Lagos? I don't know, whatever it happens to be, but yeah, I don't really have answers. I've just got kind of it's a call for engagement, I guess. Yeah.
Cool. I have lots more questions, but I think if anyone else has questions, we can also open up, or if anyone else.
Yeah, I think I'll jump in. Thanks, Richard and Dennis. I want to pick up on something that Richard mentioned, which is the idea of, you know, the music score as a fixed thing. And it seems like, you know, the music score is data, but code is something else. And how, Dennis, how can we understand code when so much of it is black boxed, like Google LM? We're kind of guessing at what it does. Is that a kind of critical or analytical leap we need to make? I mean, from analyzing an artifact to kind of guessing a function, I suppose?
Yeah, so one of the examples that I draw in, I'm quite interested in emulation, the digital emulation of analog equipment. And one of the theses that I sort of had a look at, didn't read the whole thing, too complex, but it was about the techniques for emulating guitar amplifiers in code, basically, digital emulation of. And this particular person then subsequently went and developed a really interesting technique and spoke about it at length, developed open source software for it, and then went and worked for a company pretty much straight away that was developing these plugins. And so I kind of thought, I bet there's a pretty good chance if that company is employing this person that algorithm and that idea is being used. We've got the open source software, we can kind of look at it, we can read this thesis. And speaking to other developers, it's pretty clear that there are sort of several main ways of emulating analog gear in the digital environment, and that is in various theses around, and that companies are tending to use those largely, and a lot of the energy goes into marketing. And so, it is black boxed, and it's a real problem. But one of the things I point out, I think we need to be looking at open source code, and I guess it's a slight sidetrack from that, but it does lead on to it, is that I think we're going to need to regard some of the software as kind of important cultural artifacts at some point in time. We're going to need to go back to iTunes and say, hey, this was important to our society and the world. And perhaps encouraging companies to release that as in a kind of a sort of a museum of software or something, because it has cultural value. And I think I say there is culture in code. There's aesthetics. There's aesthetic culture, sort of in emulation. If we're emulating particular kinds of guitar amplifiers, and Julian and I had a quick chat about this just in passing the other day, then that says something really important about the Vox AC30. And to see that kind of being carried on in this digital tradition, I think is really interesting. But yeah, the black boxing thing and closed source is a real issue. And as you know, I'm a big sort of proponent of open source software, but it's a problem space, I guess.
Julian.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting question, isn't it? Because I think a lot of the concerns that you raised there, if I understood your P&G example correctly, that this idea that sort of the sort of hegemonies of cultures and colonialism manifest themselves at the level of code now and AI and the way in which the world is being run. So in a sense, you said code is cultural, but perhaps code is also political in that sense, and code can be hegemonic in its own way because it will blank out certain things and privilege other things and so on. So what's interesting is that a lot of those ideas and things that you've been talking about do map across other disciplines around those things like responsible AI and so on, and the way in automatic decision making and automated decision making and so on, and the concept of the algorithmic black box, where researchers are not allowed to look inside the black box because it's commercial in confidence, and any attempt to decompile or reverse engineer software is against the law. So there's a sort of an ethical tension between the responsibility of researchers to unlock what's actually going on, but then the commercial interests which are protecting what's going on through the legal system. And there are people who've been warned or charged for attempting to look inside black boxes of Google and all the major tech companies because it's against the law.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. I mean, one of the things, I guess, where there's some distance that starts to be built, and I was just briefly talking to Richard about this before, and it's related, I think, Julian, to what you were saying about kind of where the politics of it in relation, and who's making it. In a recent paper about a group of people who are focusing on generating user-personalised, monophonic, symbolic jazz improvisations. And so it's a saxophone jazz solo improvising block of code, if you like. And one of the authors writes in relation to streaming services. perhaps the crowning achievement of such personalised services, talking about Deezer, Pandora, Spotify, whatever, would be for the content itself to be generated explicitly to match each individual user's taste. Now, for most people I know, that's quite an extraordinary leap to make. If you put Cannonball Adderley on, you kind of expect Cannonball Adderley, and that's the taste. Or there's a distance between, I think, consumers and popular music scholars and some of the ideas that are coming out with people who are on the forefront of this. And I think we just kind of need to be reading that stuff and going, oh, okay, that's an interesting way of thinking. Where does that sit in relation to our sort of scholarly discourse and how we might be able to talk about some of the ethics of the politics and so on?
Steve.
Dennis, where do you see this fitting in a contemporary music curriculum? Is this something that we should be, teaching our undergrads?
Yeah, so I suggested to my, I should be careful what I suggested to my, I suggested to my music production students the other day, after showing them Music LM and getting a few people to sort of say some ideas, that an obvious approach for music production for me, if I run out of ideas, for example, would be to type something into Music LM, get something that I liked, take it into an artificial intelligence stem splitter, split up all the things, bring it back into Ableton, convert it across to MIDI, play with it around, and kind of there are all sorts of new workflows that are developing that I don't think are necessarily problematically in terms of academic integrity. I think they're just interesting ways, and so I think I'm going to incorporate that in the first semester of next year as a case study for students to do. Take this, and as long as we can sort of do it without copyright problems, which I think we can with Music LM. I need to read the terms of service. But I think there are obvious ways of, or if not doing it in practical terms, at least talking to students and saying, hey, this is what's going on. Because a lot of our students are actually using the plugins that are based on AI every day. More than I am, which is not surprising, I guess. The ethics and the politics of it, I think, fits into, sort of the units that Adrian's talking about. I told students the other day, when I was at university, there was no such thing as a web developer. The job didn't exist. But a decade later, 15 years later, I knew a number of web developers that I'd been to university with. They're trying to explain that to undergraduates, that some of our looking ahead, we can't really foresee, but be aware of the idea that you might well be doing something now that doesn't actually exist now. So I think so I guess the short answer, Steve, is kind of awareness of it.
Thanks, Dennis. So, this is the book. If you haven't got it, think about getting it. Those of you who are on YouTube, at least order it for your library, and you can find out more about it from the Lexington and Rowan and Littlefield website. So congratulations, Dennis, on this. We will have an opportunity to toast it in a little while.
Thanks, Bridget.
But before then, we're going to hand over to the second book, which is by Dr. Adrian Renzo, who's with us, and also Liz Dufresne. It's Kylie Minogue's Kylie. So unfortunately, we have an apology. Kylie couldn't make it, and Liz couldn't make it either. She has a direct clash at UTS, so we were looking forward to welcoming her back here, but Adrian is going to have to serve for both of you. So I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Ian Collinson to talk to Adrian about the new book. Thank you.
Adrian. You managed to get me to do something I never thought I would do, which was actually talk about Kylie Minogue album. But therefore, you live long enough, you do everything twice, don't you? Before we talk about the actual book itself, could we start by looking at the series, because I think that's quite significant. Mm-hmm. For people that in the audience or listening to this who might not know about the 33 and a third book series, could you perhaps explain a little bit about it for the audience?
They look like this. They're very small, and each book tackles one album and does it in depth. So I think some of the earliest books in the series were things like Dusty Springfield's Dusty in Memphis. Then there were lots of, shall we say, for want of a better term, the usual suspects. The Beatles, Let It Be. There was Di Griffiths wrote about Radiohead. Yeah, so each book basically, it's sort of actually they all take a different approach. They take some of them are musicological works, some of them are sort of more, I guess, more philosophical. Some of them are just standard music journalism. Hey, we interviewed Duran Duran again, and let's talk about Rio. So there's a whole gamut. In fact, there's even a book published by the people who put the series together on how to write about music if you're writing one of these books. So there's a whole, it's quite well established, yeah.
Having said that, now that you've written about Kylie's first album, which is obviously an interesting choice because you could have written about Impossible Princess, Fever or Disco, all quote, ride high in the Kylie canon, but you chose the first album. Mm-hmm. So considering now that Kylie's first album, Kylie, is now is placed on the shelf, perhaps alongside Radiohead's OK Computer, James Brown's Live at the Apollo, and Kraftwerk's Computer World. What does that say about that album, and what does that say about what you're saying about the album?
Okay, can I start with what we're desperately trying not to say? Okay. This is what Rolling Stone said about the Kinks' entry in the series. Okay, you ready?
I'm seated.
Okay, you're seated, that's great. Miller makes a convincing case for the Kinks' 1968 operetta of English village life as a heartbreaking work of staggering genius. Ray Davies' greatest songwriting triumph and an unjust commercial dud with deep research and song-by-song analysis. That's not what we wanted to do for this album. Partly because both of us recognise that if you do that with Kylie Minogue, and in particular with this album, and we don't, perhaps this is a good thing, we have no audio extracts here, so I'm going to sing you the hits. You probably know them. They were, I should be so lucky, come on and do the locomotion with me, I still love you, I've got to be certain. Actually, I'll stop there. They released like 8 singles off a 10-track album, so let's just stop there. Okay, it's what one scholar calls tinny hits. Okay, the pleasures of that music are not about, wow, this is as good as Mozart or this. In fact, I might add, my co-author Liz Giuffre was recently interviewed by the Times Higher Ed supplement, and the interviewer tried to get her on record as saying, so you're saying Kylie Minogue is as good as Mozart? And Liz is like, I'm not even going there. I'm not getting involved in that debate. We're not trying to argue that this is genius. We're sort of arguing that this is, what was that thing? I learned this from you. It was a quote from Raymond Williams. What was it? Something about if
just because people do something.
Yes.
It's worth studying.
Yes. So we're not taking the Elvis Presley approach, which is, what was that greatest hits album called? 5 million?
50 million.
Sorry, the numbers are important. 50 million Elvis fans can't be wrong. We're not saying, just because 50 million people pre-ordered this album, it must be good music. But if 50 million people were interested in it, there's something going on there. There's something going on. Why was this so important for so many girls of a certain age in 1988? Why was it so important for gay men of a certain age in 1988? There's something going on there, and that's what so I guess to answer your question, 25 words or less, no, we're not arguing that this is a towering piece, work of genius, or that we should start studying the biography of Mike Stock at university. We're saying something different. Yeah.
So I suppose the idea is that there's ways of studying popular music without really talking about value. Because often I think we don't study culture at all. We study the values that we think somehow adhere or are mobilised through certain types of music.
Yes.
And that can be the problem sometimes when writing about popular music, I think, is it does become a battle of values, and you try and do that by justifying comparisons to already canonised popular music.
Yes.
Let's stay a little bit longer on the series.
Okay.
Considering the ways that lots of music, in fact, come back to some things that Dennis and Richard talked about. In an era of Spotify playlists in an era of TikTok mediation of popular music, this idea that you can write a book about a single album, a fixed piece of music, is that just completely anachronistic and misses the point of what a lot of people do with music right now?
Yeah, look, in some ways it is, I think. And I'm going to tell you about our loopholes, how we made a case for doing that here. First of all, it's historical. So we make no attempt. Do we make an attempt? We make a very brief attempt in an already brief book to talk about what the legacy of the album is. But really, we were more interested in trying to recreate the world as it appeared in 1987, 1988, to give people a sense of this is what it was like to hear this music in that time, okay? That's something that you don't get so much of online. Simon Reynolds writes a lot about this. You know how you can, for instance, you can find lots of Billboard magazine articles online. You can't, it's not until more recently that you've been able to actually go online and turn the pages of Billboard and see what advertisements were adjacent to that article. So you actually get a slice of 1988 instead of getting random bits, fragments. So I guess one of the reasons it's kind of interesting to do something like this is that it's a way of preparing almost like a time capsule. This is, we talk about, listening to this album, being part of the same audience that was in Australia, watching the Grim Reaper ads on TV at the same time as this album was coming out. What a horrible pun, I'm sorry. But at the same, we're trying to give that time capsule thing, if that answers the question, I guess.
And just the last question before we move on to something else about the series. The fact that this is part of 33 1/3 Oceania.
Oh, yes.
Does that mean it's like reserve grade? So it's in the canon, but it's like reserve grade canon. So you've got a global,
yes,
or in fact, what is like universal, sort of placeless canon that probably includes Sgt. Pepper's and Blonde on Blonde and so on. But somehow we've now got this Oceania. Wasn't Kylie good enough for first grade?
And awesome question. And let's add, there's not just Oceania. There's Brazil. There's Japan. There's 33 1/3 Europe. So now there are all these, I guess, offshoots, subsidiaries,
franchises,
which does raise the question. Yeah. So why is Kylie Minogue not in the main series? Right. The short and practical answer, of course, is a call for papers went out, and Liz and I said, "Hello." Okay. Liz said, "Look, Liz, of course, as you know, an expert on things like children's music or what's marketed as children's music.
Australian popular music.
Australian popular music and television, and the Neighbours link here is really important. My background is, I love reading about Stock Aitken Waterman and any music that's rigidly quantized and has cowbells. So that's, in all sorts of ways, this was a no-brainer. Yeah, let's put our hands up for this. But it is interesting that, even in the process of putting this book together, and I'm sure this is not. I'm not saying anything new that anyone in this room doesn't know or doesn't already know. When you put the proposal together, you're constantly being asked, okay, so talk to us about Kylie Minogue as a uniquely Australian pop star. But at the same time, tell us why international readers are going to be interested in this. You've got to make this matter to the Americans and the Brits. And in that sense, this is a perfect loophole. We had an ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card here because, of course, this album is predominantly off a British production line. It was produced by it came out of PWL Records. It was produced by Stock Aitken Waterman, all of which have, basically drained Kylie Minogue of any Australianness that she may have had as Charlene in Neighbours, right? So that way we were able to tell the publisher, of course it's international. By international, we're referring to it's got a British audience, and which says something about maybe that thing about all the old arguments about cultural imperialism. There's still something there, I think. Yeah.
Well, that's the roots of Australian popular music into a UK music mainstream, I suppose. Now we're sort of talking a bit more about the book. Obviously, the interesting thing about 33 1/3 is that it's neither wholly academic nor a wholly sort of fan-based general readership and it sits between the two, sometimes uncomfortably, I'd say. How did you negotiate the sort of the idea that you obviously there are two audiences here, and you have to try and keep them both interested, and obviously deal with the publisher's interest in wanting the publishers want to keep the two revenue streams going.
Yes.
So what did you do in order to try and negotiate that? Because that's pretty tricky, I think.
And to give you a sense of how tricky it is, can I read you 2 sentences from 2 different people who reviewed our proposal?
Sure.
You ready? Okay. I love these. So, for those of you who haven't seen the book, the contents are arranged as an acrostic. So instead of chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we have chapters K, Y, L, I, E. You know, kind of girly, kind of gay, young, long player, industry, and endurance. Okay. So, this was Liz's idea. She said, "Yeah, let's be on brand with the 80s, and let's do this sort of daggy acrostic." Okay. So 2 reviewers said, "Oh, we think the organisation of this book is good. You know, it's even catchy with the Kylie chapter headings." And then someone else wrote, "The arrangement of the chapters by Kylie's initials I find incredibly twee. For me, this gimmick only serves to reinforce what the authors don't want, to simply view Kylie through an unserious pop lens with commentary to fit accordingly." Now, which is awesome. So, okay, how did we negotiate this? So basically, all that to say, we were negotiating that from the get-go. Even the reviewers were, it was like, well, do you want us to be more academic, or do you want us to be less academic? Okay, so partly we looked at pre-existing entries in the Oceania series. So, for instance, just as we were sort of wrapping this one up, Graham Turner's Whispering Jack entry came out. So we looked at that. Hey, he has several sections where there are lots of names in parentheses, and we thought that's great. So we had a blank check to start doing the academic name dropping that you do in scholarly work. So that's fine. How do we kind of keep it, I guess, fun or of interest to a general reader? Here, I owe a lot, of course, to my co-author, Liz Dufresne, because she also has a background in music journalism, and so she's already an expert at the catchy turn of phrase, the thing that's going to sound amusing in the index. I mean, to give you a sense, she was the one who suggested, "Oh, Adrian, you've quoted Richard Smith. We need to put that in the index." So if you look up the index here, there's a quote from there's an actual term coined by the gay music journalist Richard Smith. He described Stock Aitken Waterman's music as, quote, "good faggoty pop," right? He meant that as high praise. So one of the ways we deal with that thing is to write an academic book that has these kind of little moments in it. You know, we quote someone who genuinely wrote to Rock Australia magazine in the 80s, the 70s, who named himself Eddie Cumhead, and you can find that in the index. So there's a certain irreverence here that I hope is kind of in keeping with the sort of the daggy outfits, in keeping with what Kylie Minogue stands for, I guess. I guess that's one way we sort of dealt with that.
And successfully, obviously.
Hopefully.
Oh, don't undersell yourself. Talking about faggoty pop.
Yes.
There's a whole, we can't talk about every chapter, but let's talk about one in particular, the chapter where you endeavour to explain why gay men love Kylie Minogue. I suppose in answering this, which is perhaps a question some people would ask, do you think that's an essentialist claim? And do you feel that you're sort of having to answer this essentialist question?
Yes. Short answer, yes and no. Long answer. Here we go. All right.
Okay.
I've brought my favourite book.
I'll get my drink.
And the reason I brought this is because I draw heavily on it in this book. This is a book by the scholar David Halperin. It's called How to Be Gay.
In case you don't know.
And I'm going to, I just want to read you the first sentence from the blurb. You ready? Okay. He says, "No one raises an eyebrow if you suggest that a guy who arranges his furniture just so, rolls his eyes in exaggerated disbelief, likes techno music or show tunes, and knows all of Betty Davis's best lines by heart might, just possibly, be gay. But if you try to assert homosexuality as a cultural practice, you get howled down as, that's essentialist, it's so simplistic, it's a stereotype, blah, blah, blah. I really liked his argument in this book, which was, there's got to be a way of explaining this where we don't just explain it away, because there's a real temptation to say, oh yeah, there is this sort of weird thing where gay men, if you go to the Oxford Hotel in Sydney, right, if you drive out there today, you will see a mural that has George Michael, Kylie Minogue, and Cher. Okay, now, George Michael maybe might raise an eyebrow, but certainly Kylie and Cher would not cause any surprises there. And I like, so I was sort of borrowing a leaf out of Halperin's book. How do we talk about this without sort of making it, without doing the old essentialist thing? Because of course, the people who hate that argument more than anyone are gay men themselves, right? If you're sitting at a table with a bunch of gay men, the topic of Kylie will almost inevitably come up, and it will be shot down by people who insist, I'm not that kind of gay, right? So there's a love-hate relationship going on there. And I really like the way, Halperin deals with this. He's like, the very fact that the topic comes up means it is significant to this community, and you can explain it in all kinds of ways. So there's the one people usually go for is the lyrics. So they'll often point out, okay, this is actually Richard Dye's argument about Judy Garland. Lyrics about, you've got this sort of tragic figure, and the tragic figure somehow stands in for the tragedy of, being closeted in Padstow in 1988, right? There's that argument. I like the people who sort of go, dig a bit deeper and sort of talk about, well, what about the music itself? Why this music instead of, why this tragic, Kylie's not even that tragic, right? Why this music instead of any other music? And there are all kinds of reasons. So for instance, when you read interviews with gay male fans, you find they talk about things like, Australia, 1988, it was just this wasteland of pub rock. But every time I went to a gay club, they were playing Stock Aitken Waterman. They were playing things with too many cowbells. And so, of course, there's a bit of an exposure effect there. So if that becomes the soundtrack of your life. But there's also, people are very aware of just how much flack this music was getting. Just how, it's Liz and Liz predominantly uncovered the most horrendous things appearing in mainstream media at the time. People saying, journalists writing, Minogue's plane is touching down today in Australia. Unfortunately, she's on the plane and not in front of it, right? Things like that, like wishing death on this pop star, right? There's an obvious link there between this music that's sort of dismissed as not real music, formulaic, it's got no guitars, it's unnatural. And you've got, what a coincidence, you've also got this group of people who are, who have been told, you're not a real man, there's all these kind of links between the music and how it's perceived and how this particular sociocultural group is perceived. So that's a very roundabout answer to your question, but it's yes, there is some essentialism to it, but as Richard Dye would say, sometimes the essentialism is the point. If there's in a world, BG before Grindr, right? When the only way you meet other homosexuals is to go to a club, when you need to signal, you almost need to wear it on a T-shirt. If you're not, unless you want to start lisping and sort of doing this, right? And if you, I won't say any more on that. I have more to say on that topic, right? But if you want to signal your identity to people, then this is as good a way as any. Dyer used Judy Garland in the same way that other people used Kylie Minogue to signal something about themselves and to look around to see who else is listening to this terrible, quantized, formulaic trash music. You're my people. That's, yeah. I think that's the end of my answer, sorry.
Okay, so I was just waiting. Sorry. I suppose should we let other people speak?
Sure.
Does anyone have a question? Surely. Stefan.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Adrian. Great. Looking forward to reading the book very much. I think I've already spoken with you a little bit about this because I was so fascinated in the book. And not to draw attention away from your own book, but thinking about the series, the Celine Dion book. Yes. Which would have. Oh, there we go. Okay. But in the 33 1/3 series, the one that came out, whatever it was, 20 years ago or something. I don't know which album it was of hers that they focused on.
Let's Talk About Love.
Oh, it was that? Okay,
The original title was Let's Talk About Love, A Journey to the End of Taste.
The updated version is called Let's Talk About Love, Why Other People Have Such Bad Taste. Yeah, it's a great book. Yeah, sorry, you were saying.
No, I just wondered about yours in comparison to something like that. So there's all of the Rolling Stone top 500 albums, and of course they're going to get their own book. But then, as I remember when that came out, maybe the way it was framed in the marketing, or at least, maybe even the book itself, which I haven't read, there's a tone of irony or something that maybe isn't present in what you're doing. That maybe it's disavowing the Celine Dion absolutely bad taste, whereas it's not what your argument is. So how? I just wondered how those two things compared, and had you written this book 20 years earlier, would that, and tried to sell it to 33 1/3, would you have had to have said, hey, this is just irony, this is bad taste, we're poking fun at?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. What's the difference between this and our book? There are obviously overlaps here, because we're both looking at something that's not in the canon, and that a lot of people would sort of say, what whole book? Why are you writing about this album? First of all, Wilson's book is, in my opinion, far more, more in depth. Is that the word? In terms of, he actually unpacks theoretical, like he interviews fans. His starting premise is this music, the song from Titanic, right? It was so ubiquitous, so horrible, right? Triggers me even now. So horrible. But so many million people love it. I'm going to make a concerted effort to like this. He goes to concerts and he tries to get into the and he fails. He still hates it, right? Can't. So then he talks to the fans. He tries to at least take them seriously. And he's like, no, this is not working. He goes to the scholarly literature. There's a fantastic chapter on Pierre Bourdieu, which I always assign to my students because it's an excellent intro to cultural capital, and of course there's nowhere that's more obvious when people are dismissing music, and so that's what he does. What we do, I guess, is similar but a little bit different. We basically start from the premise that we kind of genuinely. So, don't you hate being an academic sometimes? And every second word is like, oh, that needs scare quotes. But you can't. Maybe this is a podcast. You can't see my scare quotes. Anyway, we genuinely enjoyed it this was one of the first albums that Liz got, I believe. I was a huge. I didn't get the album at the time. I got all the 12-inch singles. That was my first introduction to. This is how you make a song, because the 12-inch singles separate all the layers, and here's that just one little go-go bell, and here's the little cowbell, and here's the kick drum, and now here's Kylie going, I wouldn't change. Ah, yes, and it all comes together, right? So we did genuinely enjoy the music. Our book is an attempt to, I guess, recreate what it was like to enjoy the music there, with a full acknowledgement that, yes, it has dated. Yes, some of it really is naff. There's a lyric on this album that goes, our love was a lie, and it's no secret because you told everybody. Like that's the level of sophisticated songwriting that we have here. It's not the Pet Shop Boys, it's not Bob Dylan, right? It's, so I guess that's the short answer to your question is we were trying to recreate what it was like to genuinely enjoy this music with a recognition that, this music doesn't necessarily stand up to the test of time very well, and it's not part of the canon. how do you write about music that's not part of the canon? Yes, that was certainly, I think, a fundamental early question. Yeah. No worries.
Julian.
Hey, Julian.
Thank you. I'm trying to phrase this question clearly. How was it to try and approach an in-depth study of an artist like Kylie in an album like that when the songs were written by Stock Aitken and Waterman for other artists, apparently, and not for her? So they weren't even writing for her, they were writing for other people. So the album, in a sense, became a set of hit songs that team had written, but they placed them with her and created like an album for hits, as you described. So I guess the question is, when you look at the object of study, Kylie, but in a way, in that album, it's a team of people.
Yes.
In which Kylie is like the performer. So it's a bit like the actor, where someone else has written the script and directed the movie and all that sort of stuff. How did you sort of navigate, and just a side note, the canon, I mean, I think it would be fair to say that Stock Aitken and Waterman are more part of the canon than Kylie is, right?
Yeah.
Because they are a very famous production team,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, how did you kind of approach that whole question of the essence of the album when it was, written by
It's
these
partly
three
Kylie and
guys?
partly not.
Yeah, well, but she was the performer, and you take her out of it, and it wouldn't be the same album.
Yeah.
So how did you navigate that whole terrain?
We did that partly by devoting a lot of space to Stock Aitken Waterman themselves. Right. So we wrote about not just the reception of this album, but the reception of their other music. Why they were perceived as, like for instance, there were lots of, Mike Stock, bless him, he's really indignant about this because he would, he says, look, if we released every song we produced under our own name, we were bigger than the Beatles. We had more hits than the Beatles. Yeah, that's right. It's like the Max Martin thing. Yeah.
The supermarket, no one recognised.
That's right. He's really incensed because in many ways they did pay their dues before they were producers. They were playing in bands. Matt Aitken was a perfectly good guitar, a functional guitarist. When he auditioned, he got hired because he was wearing a suit because he was used to performing on cruise ships, and he came up and he could play what was it? Not gimme. Yes, sir. I can boogie. He could play the rhythm guitar parts for that song, like just off the top of his head. So we one way we approached it, I guess, was to look at all the work that had gone in before Kylie, which allowed them to then generate things. Some of the songs, yes, were written for other artists. Some of them were written for Kylie. So, for instance, the I Should Be So Lucky is, this was what they often did. They would sit down and go, what do we know about this woman? They only had like 20 minutes or something to, she's got to go off and film Neighbours again. What do we do? She must be, she doesn't have much of a social life, does she have a boyfriend? She should be so lucky. Yeah, okay, right, okay, bang, and away you go, and then you've got the beginnings of the song. So I guess, short answer to the question, we looked at both the producers, a little bit about their history, how their work, how the whole PWL thing was perceived, why they copped so much flack themselves. That was even before sort of Kylie came on board. And then we sort of tried, and then especially with Liz's help, we tried to look at how Minogue turned it into, I guess, the Minogue package, I guess. Because it's absolutely, like you say, it's not even just about Stock Aitken Waterman, it's about Phil Harding, the guy who used to sit in the studio from like midnight to 6 a.m. coming up with the 12-inch mix. It's about all of these things. And so, all of them kind of deserve some attention. I think I'm just going to give myself a bit of a pat on the back. I think in 30,000 words, we managed to talk a little bit about all these things. So, but that's how we approached it. Yeah.
It does really get you thinking about what a performer or an artist brings to the table.
Yes. Have you ever listened to any of Kylie's songs as sung by other people? That's what, because there are always demos. Same with Rick Astley. Rick Astley was apparently given Nothing Can Divide Us as his next single, and he balked. He said, this is rubbish. I'm sick of singing this never going to give you up bullshit. Enough, right? And they gave it to Jason Donovan, right? And that went to number 4 or number 1 in the UK. And it's really interesting to listen. It's hard to tell how much of this is just retrospect talking, because when you talk to any of those producers, they all say,
oh yeah, look, we didn't have time. They just got in, we got them to sing the lines, they went. We didn't have time to, we did no demos. We saved them money, right? We just got them to record it, out the door. Kylie was different. We sensed there was something there. And I'm like, did you really? Because actually things were moving very, very quickly. They weren't even keeping track of who's at number 1 this week. They were working on the next, we need another Bananarama single. Damn, these people, So it was, so I have, I should stop there. I'll talk for hours. But yeah, it's an interesting. Yes, the thing that even factory pop, assembly line pop was not a new thing even when they came up with it, and there's so many precedents, but there's definitely something interesting about why this particular version cops so much flack. Like the Monkees didn't get as much flack. Well, no one was wishing them dead on the tarmac. The way they were wishing Minogue dead on the tarmac. Liz there's a brilliant bit in this bit that Liz wrote where she takes, Minogue was 19 years old, so she takes all these male 19-year-old pop stars, like I think, who was it? Michael Hutchence, who else does she take? She takes a bunch of them and reviews how they were received, even positively, negatively. No one wished they were dead. Right? No one was saying, there was no equivalent. There was something about this album that really made people upset. I don't know, we talk, but it's interesting to think about why this form of mass-produced, assembly line pop cops that flack and others don't. It's an interesting question. Probably much more to be said about it than in this tiny book, but yeah.
All right, how do I follow that? Congratulations, Adrian and Liz, on the book, which is available from Bloomsbury. So thank you all for a really terrific session of discussion, which has been recorded by our expert technical staff in this fantastic building, Mike Baber and Alex Ryan. So thank you, Richard and Ian, for being the discussants, and Dennis and Adrian for being our representative authors. And thank you also to Chris Muller, who did all of the organisation for today. A recording of this will soon become available on the McCall YouTube channel. So thank you all very much. Thank you.